Welcome everyone. So this is the second part in a series of hybrid workplace webinars that we're presenting. So this session will cover in more detail around identity and the joiner leaver mover process, and looking really to address the issues and complexity of what identity is within local government. So hello again, my name's Andy Taylor. I'm the lead sales engineer at ITC Secure. I cover everything around Microsoft identity and security, and I'd like to introduce Jason Banks.
Good afternoon, my name is Jason Banks. I've been working with the Microsoft Identity Stack for about 20 years now, and I have the pleasure of being the Head of Identity and Access Management here at ITC Secure.
And I've got to give apologies for Chris Howard from Microsoft. Unfortunately, he's ill today, so he won't be able to join us, but hopefully we'll be able to give you all the answers that you need today in this presentation. So this session is designed to be much more demo based, unlike the first one we did if you actually managed to take part in part one of the JML process. And to do this, we'll break down into like 3 main areas and cover them in much more detail this time. So we'll look at the joiner, mover and leaver scenario, and we'll do demos on each one. Just some housekeeping before we begin. If you need to ask any questions, if you could try and message it to us. We will attempt to answer as we go along if we can, but otherwise we'll answer in the Q&A at the end. So, like I mentioned, this is part of a series of events around hybrid working, and we'll go into a lot more detail later on about some of the other webinars we've got coming up at the end of the presentation. So I would have been handing over to Chris, who was going to talk a bit about Microsoft and identity, but we'll jump straight into the rest of the presentation now. So last time we covered who ITC was and what we do around JML, more from a business process point of view and the tool sets that we use. This session is going to be technical, as requested by a lot of you that attended the first session. So, but before we start, before we just give you a bit of a short recap on what we did on the last one, just to get everybody up to speed. So ITC, we're very capable around everything to do with Microsoft security and the identity product suites. We've got some really good skills around enterprise mobility and security, the MS stack. We also provide services via consultancy and managed service as well around things like Microsoft Cloud App Security, Defender for Endpoints, Intune, Endpoint Management, and a lot of the other Microsoft security portfolio solutions. We have got over 40 certified Microsoft professionals in our organisation with Azure skills through to identity and security. And we actually, from a Microsoft and ITC point of view, we provide a series of workshops on identity, security, Azure at no cost to yourselves, which we're happy to investigate with you and run, and we'll talk about that again at the end of the presentation. So, hybrid working, as we've seen in the last 18 months to 2 years, it's changed the way that we all work, and it's not really going to go away. So what we need to address really is we've got users that's working from home, we've got users working in the office, and we've obviously got those users that's out in the community working with citizens. And there's going to be a combination of all 3 of those. We've also got agencies that we need to work with, and the mix of how they interact with our systems, and whether we need to actually do business-to-business access for them from a partner point of view. So it's all complex, and it's going to carry on being complex. That's become the new norm, really. So at the same time, while we're trying to control these identities, we've also got people, those external threats happening, and they're growing alongside of other threats that's actually happening. Accidental threats from inside a risk, or intentional threats from inside a risk. So we really need to try and do things in a cost-effective way with the resources that we've got. And to solve this, really we see identity as the control plane that we need and make sure it sits alongside everything that we actually do. We covered a lot of this in part 1, and we've got the recording. We can send you the link afterwards. So if you want to review more from the business side, what we did. And yet again, we did have this slide in the last presentation, but I'll just do a quick recap on this. As we all know, local government's complex, and the amount of systems you need to access is a lot. Like typically, a normal local government have around about 600 applications, which some of them are old, some of them are new, some of them are on premise, some are in the cloud, but often they've got different identities and different passwords. And often these systems definitely don't interact with each other in most cases. And even some basics like actually interacting with Active Directory is limited with some certainly with the legacy apps. So this diagram's on purpose. I didn't put any flow of identity arrows on the diagram because yes, there will be some between these different systems, but there's probably not a lot of it. So having lots of disparate systems, especially on premise, causes lots of issues. We've got those multiple logging IDs, we've got users replicating passwords, and probably users forgetting their passwords, as we all know. And with us, you've probably already started on that journey to the cloud. Maybe you have done things with AD Connect, but maybe you're still using SaaS applications connected by RadioFS. And maybe we have got some identity control, but it's still a bit time consuming to maintain. We're trying to manage it, we're updating it, and we've got potential security risks with identity exposed out over various routes. So back to really what I started with, good identity is key to all of this, and to keep everything, as well as keep everything in control and to reduce that risk. So in this session, what we were going to try and show you is how ITC typically addresses this for in local government and commercial as well. It's very similar rules that apply. So we'll use some of the following demos that we're going to go through to explain how we put Microsoft Identity at the centre and provide seamless identity into all the applications. And we don't really care if they're on-premise or they're hybrid or they're in the cloud. And just for clarity as well, Microsoft Identity works with lots of other providers of services, including identity services. But what Microsoft Identity does, it acts as that glue that sticks everything together. And providing that single source of identity and controlling it is really the goal, and doing it in an easy, understandable way for the user. We don't add extra complexity to the users, so typically find ways around it. We do. What we want to show you today is how we can make one change to, in this case, an HR system, and show how that automatically ripples through all the systems you have in your environments. So let's get on with showing you some things. So the first scenario we're going to look at is what do we do when we get a new joiner? We'll just give a brief example of what typically might happen from a manual joiner activity. We've probably got a new, well, we have got a new user. Typically, that user will be enrolled into HR, and then from that point, IT or some other department, in some cases, would manually create that user into Active Directory. Hopefully, we won't be cloning the new user from the rights of an existing one in the department. This is quite common activity that wrongly happens in a lot of organisations and can cause identity creep. Some systems may be automatic after that, but typically we'll probably have to enrol them and enrol those users into maybe the expenses system, the finance, maybe they work in social service, so we have to enrol them into the social services system, and lots more apps. But we can do more. We know we need to do more than that from a joiner. They'll probably need equipment. So we'll probably normally have to do some manual process around that, or fill some forms in to actually request those equipment. And we can't forget about probably having to manually enroll into some of the cloud apps as well, and the complexity of that, and making sure that they've got correct access into it. So lots of complexity, and lots of chances for mistakes to be made in all this process. So let's talk about how we could do this from an automated point of view. As you see from this diagram, if we put Microsoft Identity into place, it allows us to do enrollment once and automate everything else with correct due diligence and make sure we're streamlining of the processes that's actually going on. So in this first demo, we're going to show the process of joining. Different organisations will be in different phases of this journey, but we're going to talk you through how a typical process will be. So a new user or users created from an HR system in the demo. In this case, we're using a SQL database, and we're going to push that into the Microsoft Identity piece to give us a consolidated view of how those identities should be across all the systems. Now, obviously, in the real world, we've got HR systems that they can be on premise or in the cloud, and we can actually pull that data in from whatever you've got in that environment. Jason will talk a little bit more about that in a second. So what we're really going to show in this demo is we've got a new user, we're going to get them creating an Active Directory from just creating them from the HR system. We're going to show some of the rules on how this is going to work, and we'll show some of the additional connected systems that we could go into. So Jason's now going to run through. So over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Andy. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start from a completely greenfield Active Directory state. Not entirely realistic, but I think for purposes of the demo, it does allow us to demonstrate quite quickly how we can take a single source of truth, our HR system, and apply that out into our connected world. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our HR data here. I'm just going to quickly re-enable my users by having a previous practice session. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this HR feed. I'm going to publish that out into our Active Directory and some downstream systems from there as well. To do that, we're going to use some of the Microsoft Identity tooling. One part of it is this tool here. This is the Microsoft Identity Manager Synchronization Engine. This is an on-premise tool that allows us to take identity data and identity adjunct data, so users, groups, devices, shared resources, and actually get them under a very tightly controlled format, and then take that and enforce it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to populate this system now. I'm going to run off a scheduled task here. Normally this would run at regular intervals. I'm just going to run it on a batch script today. And what that should do very, very quickly, I'm just going to talk for a moment while this does this, is this is going to bring in our user data. And so if I now look, what we should see is we have a consolidated view of the data that we had in our HR system is now available in this system. And this information here is the central consolidated master view of how the system thinks the Microsoft identities should look. The reason this is good is this provides us the mapping between all the different systems. So our HR system uses one set of labeling, one set of attributes. Our AD uses a different one, and our portal system uses a third. And we handle all that translation, all that mapping, so that in this case, Nancy Greenberg, who has an account name of N Greenberg in AD, may have Nancy.Greenberg.1 in a different system, and we just handle all of that transparently, but still take care to make sure that we're mapping all of the access and keeping it equivalent. I'll quickly show you the portal element to this. I don't really want to dwell on this too much at this stage. Here we go. There we go. We've got the users in. However, with these particular systems here, this is a user-facing component of that same Microsoft platform. And what this allows us to do is, as well as providing some interactive elements, the previous tool is a backroom server tool. We don't let the users anywhere near that. They don't need to see it. Whereas this side of it allows us to provide things like white pages if we want to, allows us to provide self-service, allows us to provide things like approval mechanisms, workflows, notifications, and allows us to do all those other things that Andy alluded to. So when we see a brand new user, raise a job ticket in ServiceNow to requisition a laptop. You know, notify the security team that we're going to send somebody to see them, who they need to expect, because we're going to be issuing door passes. All of those systems are there. All of those systems can then be integrated back in. And with things like door systems as well, we can actually do a lot of the non-physical provisioning parts ahead of time. And we can also do all the non-provisioning, you know, the non-physical deprovisioning at such point as we need to as well. So we can revoke physical as well as IT access. I just drop back out of there. So if I go back into here, so what we should see by now, if I refresh this, is we can now see we have all of those users that were in our HR system now come through into our Active Directory. We can look at their details, and as well as having their account provision, these accounts are all now ready to go. We'll be issuing things like usernames, passwords. We can do the password distribution mechanisms through these tools so that we can make sure that people can actually log on quickly. We've also provided some very, very basic birthright access. So in this instance, this particular user has been assigned an IT profile. I've added them to an IT group based on their department. We would normally make things here a lot richer, so there'd be access to core services, department services, job-related services, and we can apply various templates here, which are normally applied using a fairly easy-to-access mechanism. So we tend to help people set this up once and then leave them to just flesh things out as they need to. This is a fairly easy thing to do. And then they can evolve that group management over time so that it reflects their needs. As well as the account being in Active Directory, I'm hoping by now, he says, famous last words, we'll see, hopefully things should have also gone through. And we've also had those users who've been published all the way through into our connected Azure system. And then once they're in Azure, that gives us that full range of abilities to say, this user is in this group, therefore we will automatically provision them with additional licenses. So do users automatically get E3, E5, F1? Do they go into SaaS apps? Does this user need Salesforce? Does this new user need ServiceNow? Does this user need payroll? So we can start to actually push out a very, very rich user service profile very, very quickly. And the benefit of once these users are in Azure, as Andy said, Azure provides us this really, really powerful modern authentication story that we can use to access all kinds of different services, which are both Microsoft-based, AWS, Google, other SaaS. Effectively, if it talks in the right formats, this system will allow us to access it, but also wrap around all those protective services such as MCAS, multi-factor authentication, just to make sure that you're actually getting that full, rich, protected user experience. It's a seamless experience, it's simple to use, and it's still providing a very, very powerful protective layer. Andy, actually, no, before I hand back to you, I will quickly go back into here. We did say that we would show the rules. So this is a very, very pared down system, purely for demo purposes. We have a range of out-of-the-box connected systems that we can access. And when you have additional systems that you need to access, so we have things like delimited text, that makes things very easy to bring in things like CSV feeds and the like, SQL, Oracle, all the various major directory providers. But we also have this extensible connectivity capability. Now, this is a foundation of the Microsoft Identity Platform, because this allows us to reach out to other systems and create connectors that Microsoft just aren't going to do. You know, if you've got an in-house developed application, or you've got a legacy platform on RACF or Tandem or one of the older mainframe type systems, this is the kind of connector that allows us to reach into those systems to manage the identities there as well. This is even more useful to us today because in addition to this being part of this particular tool here, this Microsoft Identity Management tool, this is part of the Microsoft Cloud strategy, and they are in the process of making available the ability to take these ECMA2 connectors and actually mount them directly into Azure. So just the same as you can use the Azure provisioning systems to say, I'm going to grant this user access to Salesforce, you can actually take one of these connectors, mount it through Azure, and then actually provision your on-premise legacy systems as though it was a cloud SaaS service, which makes it very, very powerful, very, very useful to have. Any investment you make in MIM, any investment you make in Microsoft Identity, Microsoft are trying to make sure that you have as much value and longevity from it as you can. Within each of these connectors, and I'll quickly run through this, these follow a very, very simple template. We have our connection details. In this case, it's SQL, so here are our database details. We define which objects and attributes are in scope within that connected system. And then what we can also do is we can now have a look at the mapping and the transformations that we're going to apply. So we can say here, as an example, none of these attributes actually line up 100%. We've got underscores on one side, but not in our central view. We've got first underscore name mapping to given name. We just handle all of that in the background. It just works. Where we have some more complex elements in place, where we have these rules extensions, this is where we can define more complex mappings and actually build some very complicated logic if needs be to actually start to generate things. Mostly these are quite straightforward. It's largely a little bit of string concatenation, but if we need to, we can do things like, you know, in-depth lookups. So we can start to do things like ensuring that uniqueness is preserved across accounts. You know, if you have rules to do with ensuring that usernames or email addresses aren't reused for an interval, this is where we would apply the controls to make sure that these things are observed and actually enforced. Andy, back to you.
Cool, thank you, Jason. So when we start to automate, as Jason sort of showed there in the environment, we start to improve in many ways that manual processes that we've got in place. And for example, we can take those manual processes and actually free up the resources actually time to do all that creation of accounts in all the different systems. So they can actually go off and do, IT can go off and do more proactive things. We obviously going to stop a lot of the risk associated with any mistakes that a manual process could have done, and also make sure that it's a control process protected from external and insider risk in them environments. We're going to start reducing the costs, because as we've seen, we change it once, and then we automate everything from that point of view. And then from managing identities on premise or cloud, it just all happens seamlessly. So now we move on from the joiners, and we're going to look at what happens when a user is in that mover scenario. So when a user maybe changes department, or maybe they've got a temporary secondment out to a different section of the organisation, what we actually talk about is how we automate that. We're not actually sure what would have happened from a manual point of view. We've probably talked quite a lot about the complexity of the manual piece for everybody to understand. Let's just talk about how we would do that from an automated point of view as we go forward. So once the user details, again, been updated in HR, we use that Microsoft identity to remove them from their old applications because they're no longer needed. And then we're obviously going to add them and give them access rights to the new apps. Maybe they actually need some different equipment, or they have to send some equipment back, so they don't need it anymore. So we can automate that again, as Jason said, maybe with a service now ticket or even an email that actually do some automation around that point. And then maybe they need some access from a physical point of view as well. Maybe they've got different security rights now from a physical point of view, and they need access into different buildings, etc. And obviously, we want to make sure that we're protecting the data, so they can't access their old data. They'll just be able to get access to the new data that they need to work on. So in this demo, what we're going to show is a user changing role and the access rights report from applications, and then creating in some new ones. And Jason will show this workflow and its capability to basically automate anything in that process. So back to you, Jason.
Cheers. Right then, so go right the way back to our single source of truth. What we're going to do is I'm going to select a couple of volunteer users here. So I'm going to use Stephen King, and I'm going to use my Lex DeHaan users, and they're going to be exchanging departments. But what we're going to do first, before I kick that off, I probably should have thought about that one. Probably happened already. Is we're going to quickly check to see where the user's sitting already. So we can see Steve King here is in the executive department. I suspect I've probably moved him too quickly, and the automated system in the back end's just shifted in. But in theory, what we would normally see there is he would be losing, the access that he originally had, and he would have been assigned new access. So I will swap him back round just so we can actually see that happening in Active Directory. Now, this is a very, very basic example, but if you can imagine this is across disparate systems, particularly when they're not already connected up, you've got to raise requests, you've got to wait for somebody to actually go and do something. Actually, that removal of access can be even more challenging than actually granting the new access, because it doesn't get in the way. So I think this is where we see people getting into difficulty over time, is because people accumulate permissions. They don't lose the ones that they don't need anymore. And what that does mean is you can end up with people, particularly if you are then going on to clone accounts, and please don't. But it does mean that people are inadvertently accumulating these large profiles of roles, and that can potentially then lead to toxic combinations where people can request services and approve services at the same time, which they really shouldn't be able to do. It's very rarely malicious in our experience, but it's the kind of thing that can actually creep up on people very, very quickly, particularly when you've got disconnected islands of identity and identity access rights. Let's just refresh this. This is where I had him in the right place all along. There we go. So we can see that this particular user has now changed role. He's moved from being in the executive branch into the IT branch. He's lost his executive access because actually he's in a new role. He doesn't need that anymore. And he's now got a more fitting for his new role IT access level. Again, this is very, very basic for demo purposes, but this would be applied across all of his roles. We can reevaluate as the user changes, as the role definitions change, they can be reevaluated automatically and then enforced out into the world.
And just to point out as well, that because we've changed that user's department role and security, that could then be tied into something like Intune or Config Manager, and we could go and actually uninstall applications and install applications. Sorry, Jason.
No, that's fine. And again, that is a very, very useful thing to be able to do, particularly if you have a heavily managed desktop environment. Okay, back to yourself.
Thank you. So for our final demos, going to take a look at what a good leaver would be and maybe a user that we've had to put on critical hold. So yeah, again, back to that same premise, we're going to update HR once. In this case, on the first demo, we're going to update the users leaving. Now, obviously, that could be because they found a different job, or maybe we're actually doing a big bulk of users because we may be doing a multiple agency transfer or whatever, or they could just be retiring. So with the leaver process with Microsoft Identity, we can then ensure all of the correct access is deactivated. We can put the process flow in there to get equipment returned, and obviously we can start protecting that data so they don't have access rights into that data. But we might actually need to still provision that user into some systems that's leaver type based systems, be it like a pension system or pay slips, so they can get future reference on them for a period of time. Obviously, this can be complex if we're doing it in a manual way and things can be missed again. So if we automate it, we're reducing that cost and reducing that risk. So in this first demo, what we'll see is HR will get updated, get the user deactivated by the Microsoft Identity, and Jason will also show like some of the workflow and how the magic actually happens behind the scenes. For the second part of the demo, we'll actually show something where we've actually had to put a user on critical hold. So yet again, HR, key, unique piece of information, something's changed, but in this case, that we need to put that user on critical hold. As we put that user on critical hold, that could be while we need to do some investigation to take place. That could mean, yet again, deactivating their access, maybe putting their account on legal hold to retain any data. Maybe we need to make sure we get the equipment back for forensic examination, and most certainly need to probably collect some more data on user activity via logs or other Microsoft security systems or other systems you've got in place. So in the final part of this demo, we'll show how we can use the identity to get that user into that criteria. Back to you, Jason.
Excellent. Right then, so again, very, very simple terms. We're going to go back into my HR system as our source of all truth. And I'm just going to quickly flag one of my users here as being a leaver. What we would do here is we'll now allow that to just quickly process through. And what we should see very quickly is that our user here vanishes out of our active container and is moved into our leavers container. They're automatically disabled. And at this point, we've performed a very, very basic, this user has now left the building. Obviously, in the real world, we'll be able to do a lot more here. So we'll be providing things like notifications. So we'll be able to say this user is leaving with a week's warning, 2 weeks warning, so that people are aware this is about to happen. We can make sure that things like equipment, passes, etc. are all being recovered correctly. We can make sure that if there are any other processes that need to be triggered, we can make sure that they're factored in. And we can also make sure that we're providing things like, at the minute we've disabled this account and moved them into a levers container, we would then typically, after a short period of time, remove this user from all of their access as well, and then following another interval, actually remove the account itself. It's actually no longer of any value. And then at that point, that user account is then closed, removed, and gone. What I'll quickly do as well is I'm going to select my Lex Dehaan user. And this time, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flag them as being on hold. And I'm just putting this is our internal demo HR system. There are various mechanisms for doing this, either through HR or through affiliated systems where we can actually flag the user as being in that hold situation. So now if I go and I find their user account here, we can see now that actually this user hasn't been moved to the levers container because they're not actually a lever at this stage, they're on hold. But they have been disabled so that they can't access the account. And this is particularly useful to do with this kind of automated system because, say, for example, this user knows somebody in the IT service desk, rings his friend up and says, "Oh, I've got a problem with my account, can you sort me out, please?" Even if somebody is to go into Active Directory and re-enable the account, then the automated system's actually designed to detect that kind of event and actually enforce the business rules, the IT systems logic, to ensure that that account actually goes back to being in a controlled state as quickly as possible. So as we can see now, that's now been reapplied. That user has been locked down. So even going in and re-enabling the account doesn't matter. The system will self-correct over time. And the reason that we deliberately try not to treat these users as explicit levers is that actually, if they're on hold for all different kinds of reasons, this might be a sabbatical, this might be somebody is under investigation, that there are all sorts of legitimate reasons for placing an account on hold. But if it is a disciplinary issue, we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently allow the account to go into the levers process and be potentially deleted before we've finished capturing any evidence that we need. But essentially, this allows us to apply all those different controls around it and then enforce them. So we maintain the integrity according to the system and according to the source of data that we have available to us.
We also can use that marker pushed up into Office 365. So where we need to actually do legal load or some of the great features of Office 365 has got about protecting that data and making sure retention's done, that can all be picked up inside Office 365.
Yeah, and obviously, if we come into our Office 365 here, what we will see, assuming that the on X, yeah. So we can see as an example here that our Lex Dehaan user has been disabled. So this user isn't able to get in through their Azure account, not able to get through their on-premise account. And again, we would apply that out into all the different accounts that we were managing on this user's behalf. So if they were on some of these other connected systems that we were managing the accounts directly, we'll be going into all of those systems and making that same change there to make sure that there wasn't a route in for this user anywhere. Andy?
Okay, so thank you all for listening so far. And now myself and Jason are happy to take any questions you might have got. We have got a few that got sent beforehand via email, so let's probably start with that to make the pertinent questions to everybody. I'm going to ask Jason one of them. So Jason, we've got asked, how could the JML process be used to consolidate or merge together multiple LRGs?
Well, one of the things that we do with the Microsoft tooling is the demo we've seen today is taking a HR system as a source of truth. What we're also able to do is take other identity stores as a source of truth. So what we can do as part of a mergers process is actually take in the identities from 2 or more parties and then consolidate them across both sides. So we can try and work out, well, actually, which names are available still, where we've got collisions, how do we resolve that, and actually then manage that across so it's done in a controlled manner, and eventually, hopefully, move to the point where we can actually say, well, we've actually got all of our users in one place anyway. But as a temporary position, we can actually start stepping through the different stages of that process. So we have the identity system move and change and flow with the merger process itself according to where you are along that process. And the tooling is actually very, very flexible for doing that sort of thing.
Excellent. Bill, please feel free to ask any questions you want via the text, or we can unmute everybody now if you want to actually ask it via old-fashioned voice. But while we wait, somebody's got any burning questions, and I think you covered this one off a little bit anyway, Jason, but initially a lot of the connectors we seem to show was on-premise, but how does that flow through to the cloud? I think you covered a lot of that off, but just a basic explanation of how we go from on-premise into the cloud, and we provision out into something like Sales, well, not Salesforce, probably a bad example, but a training system, for example.
The way that we work with the Microsoft tooling is we try and place the right thing, the right components in the right place. So we're very, very agnostic as to this. We don't show up and say, right, you know, we've got one set of tools, this is what we're going to use. So what we're trying to do at all times is produce the most appropriate way of connecting into the system. So for some systems, that might be we actually go directly via Azure, and we use an Azure SaaS provisioning component. So we get the identity into Azure, and then we use Azure SaaS tooling from there. If we can't do that, what we can always do is the on-premise connectors can actually reach into SaaS services. So there is nothing stopping us at that point reaching out through one of those ECMA to those extensible connectors into a disconnected, if you like, system. So it doesn't have to be an on-premise system, it can actually be another cloud system. So say, for example, you've got a third-party SaaS app that you're using that isn't part of the Azure ecosystem. That's fine. As long as there's an API we can connect into, then we can actually still access and manage accounts through that. And we find that a lot, particularly in education, actually, where there's a lot of education providers are using US-based, for some reason, SaaS services for their online learning environments. So again, we reach into those APIs, we provision the user accounts for staff and students in that particular instance, and it's, you know, technically it's a cloud SaaS thing, but it's not Azure connected.
So if there's no questions from anybody, well, speak up now, and you want to ask anything. Otherwise,
although again, if anything does occur, because I know what I'm like, All my questions usually come to mind about 3 minutes after the call. Please feel free to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to wrap up, Jason, thank you. So thanks for listening, and just a reminder, this is like the first part of a series of hybrid working webinars that we're doing. We've got the next one we're doing is actually next week on the 7th of October, and we're covering off on that one around actually managing users and access and managing those devices in that way that we're having to work at the moment, being at home or office, etc. The next one after that is we're going to do an in-depth look at threat using solutions such as Microsoft Sentinel and some of the threat protection tools. That's on Thursday, the 21st of October. And we'll finish off the year with a very detailed view of hybrid working around some more pieces on identity, but more around governance this time. Now we actually address that governance piece. That's on Thursday, November the 18th. Yeah, again, the lobby on about over lunchtime again, 12 o'clock until 1. We also, as I mentioned at the start, there's some other next steps that you can potentially we can do together. Microsoft several no-cost accelerator workshops that we can provide for you. These are around securing identity, endpoint management, threat protection, and Azure Sentinel. Workshops tend to run over a couple of days. We put one of our consultants with you, obviously virtually with you, to actually implement a mini proof of concept, mini piece inside your environment to let you see how the solutions work with some real users, real devices and data in your environments. So if you want to actually look at running some of those, please reach out to us. And we also have some other rapid deployment services as well as a company. So they're fixed price costed pieces of work that we can undertake in your environment. And yet again, for what we've been talking about today, we've got a fixed price JML automation service that we can look to do with you, and also looking to take you on a zero trust section in your environment as well. So just to wrap up, we'll send you out the slides that we've done today. The meeting was recorded, so we'll send you out the details of the recordings for part 1 and for part 2, so you can actually go back and look at it. If there's anything you want or any questions, as Jason mentioned, if you think of anything after the event, please reach out to us and we'll try our best to answer them. So with that, yeah, again, thank you very much for your time, and we'll close off the session.